Welcome to all of you. Welcome to the 2023 fall lecture of the BU Institute for Philosophy and Religion. I'm David DeCosimo. I'm the director of the Institute and associate professor of theology and ethics. And for more than the usual reasons, I'm glad to be with you today. So the BU Institute for Philosophy and Religion was founded over 50 years ago by a group of philosophers, theologians, and scholars of religion who were among Martin Luther King Jr.'s graduate teachers and advisors. And at a pivotal moment in the history of the university, in this country, and of this university in particular, amidst a rising move towards a kind of hyper-specialization and a temptation to put to the side the kinds of ordinary questions that ordinary people ask about the most important things, they wanted to create a site, an enduring locus within the university where people who are scholars, students, and members of the broader public could come together to think well, with discipline, with creativity, and with courage about the most important things, including the very kinds of questions that lead people to get interested in philosophy, religion, or theology to begin with. And so for 50 years, the mission of the Institute has been to attempt to foster at BU and in the broader public engagement with these sorts of questions. And it is difficult for me to think of a speaker more apposite for engaging us in that very task today than our distinguished lecturer, Dr. Zena Hitz. Dr. Zena Hitz is a tutor at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, and is currently on a sabbatical fellowship sponsored by the Princeton program in philosophy of religion and Princeton's James Madison Institute for American Ideals. Dr. Hitz was herself an undergraduate student at St. John's College and went on to receive a master's degree from Cambridge University and to receive her PhD from the program in classical philosophy at Princeton University. Now, so far, my comments have strictly adhered to the norms and standards of a talk such as this in terms of introducing the speaker. But in an important sense, I don't think that that succeeds in introducing Zena Hitz. I first came to know of Zena through hearing about her book, Lost in Thought, published by Princeton University Press in 2020, at a moment where almost everyone I respected was talking about it, not least my fifth grade idol, the great MC Hammer, who inspired me and several of my friends to create a short-lived R&B group, about which I'll say no more. It was the midst of the pandemic, and for my own part, I was recovering from, or trying to recover from, a series of experiences that had seemed to expose me to the worst of what the contemporary university had to offer, and that left me asking myself whether I even wanted to be a part of it anymore. And it was in that moment and at that time that Zena's book came my way. And I didn't want to get my hopes up because I didn't want to be disappointed still further. I was not disappointed. In the book, I felt myself being called back to the very questions that had led me into the study of philosophy and religion to begin with. The kinds of human questions that down through the centuries, people have asked and thought about themselves in moments of triumph and tragedy, in moments of enjoying the splendor of beauty, in moments of fellowship with one another around a table. And I found this book to be a meditation on these things, and I found Zena's own story in it a beautiful picture of her own effort to follow after these things. And so I am delighted to welcome her here to engage with us at BU as she speaks about God and the search for happiness.
Thank you, David, for those remarks. It's a strange privilege and relatively new to me to write things that touch people. So I'm always grateful and in some kind of awe when I hear that. So thank you for sharing it. This talk, as David alluded to, I have a personal story that's a bit dramatic that connects God and the search for happiness. And part of that story is told in Lost in Thought, my first book, and part of it, a different part of it, is told in the book that came out more recently, which is called A Philosopher Looks at the Religious Life. And this talk comes from this more recent book, and it's not going to be based in my own experience, although you can ask me anything you like afterwards. I'm going to be talking about a different set of examples. So when I'm describing the religious life and what the book itself focuses on, just to be perfectly clear, it's the religious life specifically of Christians. So, and that's not out of any sense that this is somehow central to the human experience, except that it is just the type of the version of this type of life that I'm most familiar with. So it was easiest for me to speak from, and I had made some efforts to connect it in all of its depth and richness to all of the global Christian traditions, but I'm not able to talk about the forms of religious life in Hinduism and in Buddhism, and even there are versions of a certain kind, you could argue, in both Judaism and Islam. And I'm reminded of seeing this beautiful library and knowing that I'm talking to a widely diverse group of people. So the religious life in this context refers to the way of life lived by radical Christians, where men and women abandon ordinary ways of life: marriage, family, wealth, commerce, power, for lives of solitude, prayer, and service. So such are the lives of contemporary nuns, monks, friars, hermits. And such was the life of the founder of Christian monasticism, who I'll use briefly to introduce the talk, Antony the Abbot. So Antony grew up in a prosperous Christian family. So I begin the talk with stories. I'll say this too, but as a matter of preface. This talk begins with stories. I have 2 lines of analysis of this type of thing that are going to come into the talk. I feel confident they have a relationship to one another, but I'm not exactly sure what it is. So I'm going to be grateful for your help in bringing that out. And I will signal to you each of the 2 strands so that you can catch on. I think they're each understandable on their own anyway. I'm just giving you a warning that there's something I'm grasping for in this talk that's not going to be fully articulate. But the stories, I think, will be, that's always why it's better to have stories, because when your thinking is less clear, you can anchor it in something concrete. Okay, so Antony grew up in a prosperous Christian family in provincial Egypt in the 3rd century CE. His parents died when he was a young man, leaving him 300 fruitful acres. Not long after their death, he walked to church, thinking about how in the book of Acts, the disciples sold all they had to live in common, giving to each according to his need. While sitting in church, in the liturgy, he heard the gospel of the rich young man. A young man asks what he must do to inherit eternal life beyond the following of the commandments. Jesus tells him to sell all he has, give it to the poor, so that he will have treasure in heaven, and to follow him. The young man goes away sad because he had many possessions, as the gospel reads. So Antony took the gospel as a direct personal instruction. He sold his lands, gave away his possessions, and went to live in solitude in the desert. Flocks of disciples chased him into ever more remote places, and his life, written by Athanasius, the church father, caused a sensation in late antiquity that lasted at least until the time of Augustine. Augustine's Confessions mentions the story of Antony of Abbott and the life that Athanasius tells of it. And it inspires religious foundations in the East and in the West. So what would such a story, the story of Antony, tell us about human happiness? Should happiness be associated in any way with what Antony is seeking? I want to argue that he is seeking something like happiness, and he and some other similar figures who I'll describe in a second. So, but first, let's look at some somewhat more recent lives that bear some strong resemblance, but have their own texture and their own details. And they have a somewhat more rich and interesting account of their motivations than we have in the sources about Antony. So, first example of Mother Walata Petros, who was an Ethiopian noblewoman of the 17th century, had 4 children in a row who died shortly after childbirth. After that, wrote her hagiographer, she bore in mind, this is his words, she bore in mind the transience of the world. This hagiography, by the way, was translated into English in this beautiful edition that came out just a few years ago. I highly recommend it. It's completely fascinating, the life of Mother Walata Petros. So her husband, the husband of Walata Petros, still loved her, but she no longer wanted to stay with him after the death of her children. She spent her days in prayer and fasting and her night in vigils. She threw banquets on holidays to which all were invited, the poor and the wretched, along with the townspeople and the priests. When her husband left on a military campaign, she saw her chance. She gave away all her possessions, including 80 ounces weight of gold of jewelry, and with 2 monks and 3 servants, walked all through the night. They traveled several days to the monastic settlement at Zadeh, where Walata Petros shaved her head, put on a nun's cap, and swore to remain for the rest of her life. As it turns out, she couldn't stay long. Her husband hears about her departure. He sends a small army after her. They destroy a town near Zadeh, and she sees how much damage he's causing, so she goes back to live with him just to avoid further damage. Even though her heart still wanted to be in the monastery, still wanted to be a nun. Now, the call that she receives, this call for the religious life, happens at a time in high conflict in Ethiopia. At the time, thanks to the arrival of Portuguese Jesuit missionaries, the Roman Catholic faith is starting to make inroads into the ancient Christian practice of the Ethiopians. So Ethiopia is one of the very oldest Christian communities in the world, and it becomes a Coptic Orthodox, so a part of the Coptic Church, which is connected with the Christianity in Egypt. But that's not good enough for the Portuguese Jesuits. They want to make them Roman Catholic. So they're trying to make inroads into Ethiopia. The king has converted to Roman Catholicism, and the Coptic Orthodox patriarch, who Walata Petros follows, has been murdered, and as a part of this power struggle. So Walata Petros, when her husband starts to show sympathy with the Catholics, and she stops eating, drinking, or beautifying herself, and she lives, as it's put, as a nun in her husband's household. Her husband lets her go finally, on her way somewhere else, living to her brothers. The king kidnaps her and tries to get her to convert because her witness for orthodoxy is so scandalous, because she's a well-known noblewoman. So she's imprisoned for a time, finally freed, finally returns to the monastery where she had been many years earlier. So she continually gathers disciples, even when she's imprisoned, and once released, she moves frequently, formed all in all 6 communities, and the last of which was apparently 800 people. Okay, so the vocation, both of these stories are what you call a vocation story, a call to the religious life. When someone is living one form of life, they receive something happens to them, they hear some word that changes them, they have some experience that changes them, and they give everything up to do something different. So this was rooted, if we remember, to her reflection after the death of her children, in the transience of things. And the transience is one of the main threads that I'm going to try to develop and work out in the course of this talk. Thinking about, oh no, thank you, I have tons of water under here, but thank you. Actually, I'll take yours. Thank you. Okay, where was I? So she perceives the transience of things, and that's the thing that sparks this intense desire, whereby she overcomes multiple very serious obstacles to finally achieve her desire of living like a nun. And also at enormous sacrifice. This is a person of great privilege, power, wealth, beauty, all of it she gives up. So this idea of transience and the kind of grief that she suffers before receiving this call might be illuminated by a 20th century Orthodox nun, a European nun, who found her vocation after the death of her infant daughter. This is Mother Maria Squatskola, which I can never pronounce, so forgive me if I mispronounce it. She describes her manner of mourning after the death of her daughter. For some, it is not even a question of grief, but the sudden opening of gates into eternity, while the whole of natural existence has lost its stability and its coherence. Yesterday's laws have been abolished, desires have faded, meaningless has displaced meaning, and a different, albeit incomprehensible meaning has caused wings to sprout at one's back. Into the graves, this is Maria, Mother Maria, into the grave's dark maw are plunged all hopes, plans, habits, calculations, and above all meaning, the whole meaning of life. In the face of this, everything needs to be re-examined or rejected against falsehood or corruption. For Mother Maria, grief reveals the truth about the world. She says that grief suddenly reveals the nature of things, excuse me. So for Mother Maria, the collapse of meaning in the heart of grief, the sense that everything is transitory, passes away, disappears into nothing, clarifies the eternal. There's some mysterious vision of the eternal that comes out of it. So the vision of death, which somehow destroys every illusion, reveals a reality in a way that she admits is mysterious, that's beyond things that die. So set aside for the time being whether and how there is an eternal reality or how it could be unveiled by such an experience. Why does Mother Maria think that life without grief is a kind of blindness or illusion? Why would grief reveal the nature of things? I think the fundamental reality indicated here, as in Mother Willata Petros, is that the child was always a mortal thing. Everything that we love and care about is mortal and passes away. Death is the eternal destination, universal destination, sorry. So we consider it great grief, and it truly is, to witness a death that's out of its proper time. But apart from its intense emotional valence, it's not obvious why something inevitable that happens earlier should be seen as an interruption of the way things are. So there's a gap between the experience of the grieving person, which is that the whole world has somehow been disrupted. But if you try to step back from it and think about the fact that the person who dies in an untimely way was always destined for death, it becomes more bewildering and confusing. There's some kind of vertigo starts to emerge. So Mother Maria, I think, is suggesting that you see the nature of things, that is, somehow ordinary, regular life is premised on an illusion about the way things matter that ignores their transience, ignores the fact that they are temporary and will end in death or decay or destruction. So the perception of transience, the universal destiny of all things in death and decay, is also at the root of some other vocation stories, even where the vocation is a reaction to success and happiness rather than pain or grief. So here's another story. So I had Antony, Mother Willata Petros. Here's another story. This story comes from Teresa of Avila's account of the foundation of her monasteries. Teresa of Avila, the great 16th century mystic and writer, who also reformed the Carmelite order and founded many monasteries. So she tells a story of another noble woman with a vocation. This woman is named Doña Casilda. She's beautiful, and she's the heir to a huge fortune. Her two older siblings have joined the religious life themselves, so her family's very anxious. They don't want to lose another child to the religious life. So they betroth her to a relative when she's very young. She's 10 or 11 years old. And then she falls deeply in love with her fiancé. Teresa writes, this is Teresa writing about Doña Casilda. She'd been spending a very happy day with her betrothed, whom she loved with an intensity rare for a child of her age, when suddenly she became very sad, for she realized that the day was over and that all other days would come to an end in the same way. So even in this case of an extremely happy moment, there's a sense that somehow it passes away just like all the other days will. So then we get another story of intense drama and struggle as this young woman tries to enter a convent. So she attends a liturgy where a young woman is receiving the Carmelite habit. She's sort of enchanted by the monastery. It's one of Teresa's foundations, the poverty of the place. But she meets with a number of obstacles. So her family really don't want her to do it. So at first, she's refused entry by the prioress because her family won't let her do it. Then she sets up a complex gambit where she, while out on another errand, asks to stop by the monastery to donate some wood. And then she runs out and throws her arms around the statue of the Virgin Mary. But her family, at that point the prioress admits her, but the family removes her by a royal order. So she's back at home again, stuck, no support from anybody. And then finally she sees her chance. She's attending Mass at a church. Her mother steps away into the confessional. She sends her governess off to pay for a Mass. And then she tucks her shoes under her skirt and runs as fast as she can out the door to the convent, which is apparently some distance away. As soon as she gets there, she's admitted and she becomes a nun. Part of the reason I love these stories is the intensity that you can see in the desires of these people to live in this way. It's an intensity that's very mysterious and also, I think, very touching. So somehow the attraction to a vocation is strong enough to break every human bond with not only the bonds of the romantic attachment, Doña Casilda and her fiancé, Mother Willata Petros and her husband, but also ties to one's parents, one's siblings, and one's origins. There's a more famous vocation story of Thomas Aquinas, so this is maybe a more familiar story than the other two. His noble family intended him to become a monk at a wealthy monastery, but he meets these weirdos, the Dominican friars, who are kind of the new cutting-edge radical sort of, the Occupy Wall Street of the religious orders of the day. He's just enchanted with them, so he joins them. He's on his way to Paris to their seminary, and his family kidnaps him, takes them to their house, sends him prostitutes, locks him in the dungeon, and only after a year of complete stubborn resistance do they finally give in. So that's just a case where again, status, wealth, bonds with parents, all just turn to dust in the face of this desire. So it's impossible to believe that a sort of bloodless intellectual conviction could lead to something like this, I don't think. So I don't think if you read The 5 Ways of Thomas Aquinas or a piece of theology or a really great argument about what the happy life is about, I don't think that it would motivate these kinds of incredibly determined sacrifices. And I don't think either ambition could do so, at least not obviously. In these cases, in fact, the motivation is running against ambition. rather than the other way around. They're giving up wealth, nobility, comfort, prestige, power, all the things that people would normally fight or die for are being sacrificed. Okay, so what drives these men and women? What's the character of their motivation? So in what follows, I make 3 suggestions. As I say, I'm not exactly sure how they all fit together. But the first thing to say is that it also doesn't seem to be fear or despair that motivates them. So fear can drive a person to certain kinds of extremes. This is a fictional example, but if you've seen The Sound of Music, right, Maria, she falls in love with her employer, and it terrifies her, so she flees back to the convent. But she doesn't resist very hard when the Mother Superior kicks her back out again. She goes back pretty willingly with a little bit of pressure. She doesn't act like these other people who are determined against all obstacles to commit. So, there's a sort of repeated refrain in popular films that I think is also clear in the hagiographies and in the theological treatments, that it's being drawn to religion isn't a losing, or it's not an entirely negative, it's not a rejection, but something different, something positive. The difficulty I think that we struggle with is that the nature of that positive goal is hard to understand for us, and I think for people in any time and place, to be perfectly honest. Okay. So it seems worthwhile to test the hypothesis that fits these phenomena the closest, and that is that these are men and women in love, right? This is a love-driven phenomenon. Now, again, that doesn't really help too much, because in love with what or whom? Maybe with poverty, that's one thing. Or they're in love with the Jesus Christ of the Gospels, right? The poor man of poor men, the person who sacrifices all for the love of his neighbor. But I want to begin at a more abstract level and think about the problem that sets the background for the development of this love or passion, the problem of transience. So we have the transience of things with Mother Wada and Mother Maria. We have the best days coming to an end in Doña Casilda's place. And these kinds of perceptions might inspire resignation, despair, misery, but they don't. So one simple suggestion might be that these women are in love with God as transcendent and eternal. So they're in love with something which has the features, whatever its other features, of being undying and outside the natural realm. So that love is sparked by an insight that leads them to reject the ordinary objects of love, wealth, power, and even distinctive human individuals, husband, fiance, mother, father, sibling. In this respect, their love for the eternal and transcendent demands a total renunciation or total dedication, depending on which way you look at it. So it's total renunciation if you look at what they give up. It's total dedication if you face towards whatever it is they're looking at. So I want to use one more story to try to bring out the other dimension that I'm interested in that's not transience, even though it sounds like it. And this is another fictional example. It's the story of a young nun that's presented in the 2013 Polish film called Ida. So Ida, who's the protagonist, has been raised in a convent. She's prepared to make her profession and join the community. But she leaves for a time to get to know her one living family member. She spent her whole life in the convent up to that time. And while outside the convent, she also meets this very attractive young jazz musician. They eventually spend the night together. The next morning, he asks her to spend the day with his jazz band. And she asks, "Oh, what do we do after that?" And he says, "Oh, well, we buy a dog, Well, what about after that?" "Oh, we get married and have a couple of kids." What happens after that? That's the last question we hear from her. We see her put on her habit and go back to the convent. So this is a person who turns away from a happy romance and all that it's offering in that moment And she's asking a question that sounds a bit like the question that the others are looking at, right? What happens after that? I do think that the question about what happens after that looks to me like it's not really about transience. It may be, but it may not be. It might be something about purpose. So, what does this all lead to? What does it all culminate in? What's the point of this type of life? If I dedicate my life to this person, what's the crowning jewel that I get from it? What's the ultimate payoff, to put it in a kind of mercenary way? So what does the love of these two people going to culminate in beyond itself? So I have this instinct that the question about transience and the question about purpose are not unrelated. But again, I'm going to be struggling a bit to put them together. We are accustomed to thinking of purpose as irrelevant to how long something lasts. So it's true that if I go to the grocery store to buy tamarind paste, as I tried to the other day, and they don't have any tamarind paste, my purpose has been thwarted. My task is futile. But suppose that the purpose is something that's built into my activity. So I'm gazing at the sky because it's beautiful. I'm doing mathematics because I love it. In these activities, which we might call from the Aristotelian tradition leisurely, they're things that are valuable in themselves. They're culminating activities. You don't look for anything past them. You don't ask what happens next because you seem to escape time and temporality. You're not waiting for some future culmination of your action. You have what you want right there in the moment. And romantic love surely has immanent value of this kind. Beholding and spend time with the beloved, it's sufficient unto itself. You're not sitting there thinking, what happens next? Yet our protagonists don't seem to see it that way. They find it somehow lacking in what they want. So it seems to be that the fact that even the most wonderful experiences, now I'm thinking also about Doña Casilda, even the most wonderful experiences happen in a sequence, one after another, each coming to an end. They cannot qualify as the kind of goods that make life worth living. All of the goods a person might dream or strive for, including the most meaning-laden activities, including the ones that seem to lose their, that seem to be complete in the moment, they all turn to dust. So the universality of transience, too, is what makes these stories common to both people who suffer some grief or people who are in the midst of some success. It's like either way, either you've lost something that you thought was good, or you have something good and you realize it's not going to last. So the transience seems to be dominant over questions of purpose. Okay. So one suggestion I want to make is that now I'm going to try to be putting those things together, and then I'll stop talking and take questions at some point pretty soon. So be patient. It seems that loving something entails wanting it to last. And that seems true for a beloved human being as much as for your favorite teapot. Maybe I'm the only person. I once wept at my favorite coffee cup getting broken, and that might have been excessive. But it was true. It was genuine grief. I wanted it to last forever. It didn't last forever. So there are precious experiences that are essentially shaped by their ending, like a piece of music or a certain kind of conversation. But if a beloved piece of music or a conversation partner were to be permanently extinguished from the face of the earth, our response would be grief. So our concern for even these experiences that are marked temporally it brings with it a desire that something lasts forever. That is the source of those things keep on enduring. So it's true that our experiences are episodic. They happen one after the other. But it's also true that we carefully cultivate the objects of our experience. We take care of them, we support them if they're people, or we donate or volunteer to support them if they're experiences, or we preserve or develop them if they're lands or places or communities or objects. And these are the activities that seem to give our lives meaning, that seem to provide for our happiness. We could also create and invent, seeking new experiences, lost to the old ones. But we could not do any of this, it seems to me, unless we imagined, and this gets back to the illusion of Mother Maria, unless we imagined that what we were building or nurturing would last. As we live our lives caring for people or music or dance or conversation or whatever it is, we perceive greater and greater richness in their objects, and we care about them and dread their loss all the more with the passage of time. So this is all a development of the thought that loving something entails wanting it to last. So the fact that we're often reconciled to the chaotic destruction and replacement of various things doesn't seem to me to mean that we desire them to last only for a certain time. Doesn't seem like a counterexample to this kind of point. Because when we're truly reconciled to the loss of something, it's not because we found something new. We've put our focus elsewhere. So our love for something has died, and we've shifted it somewhere else. It's not that somehow we only wanted this thing to last for a certain period of time. We divide our attention. We hedge our bets against grief and loss. We love conditionally, and when the conditions fail, our love fails, we move on to something else. But I think this is true. I could be persuaded otherwise, but I think it's true that to hold something in loving attention while being reconciled to its permanent annihilation is not possible, not humanly possible. So now I'm getting to a place where I hope that the question about purpose and the question about transience might come together. The fear of death and the fear of loss makes it difficult to devote ourselves to something completely. Because of these fears, we are naturally half-hearted. Lukewarmness, which I'll explain in a second, is sort of a natural condition of self-protection against loss. By contrast, wholeheartedness that these people we described seem to exhibit means putting all your eggs in one basket and waiting for the basket to break, waiting for the eggs to break, as all eggs do. So these characters in their story, as I've suggested, their stories, they display a quality that one might call total dedication. So part of the charm and the drama of the stories is not just that they flee transitory things, but that they flee virtually everything, again, to list the things they've given up: parents, siblings, romantic love, sex, marriage, children, wealth, power, status, etc. So what does it mean to really be totally dedicated to something? We say that someone's dedicated their life to mathematics or music or ending the achievement gap or teaching or sewing or gardening. We speak this way: they dedicated their life to X. And we don't tend to mean that they literally everything they did was mathematical or musical or sewing or gardening. But it might mean that everything that doesn't contribute to the end is discarded. It might mean something less stringent. I discard everything incompatible with the end. So it's not I don't think, at least, it's not that everything about that activity takes over every aspect of your life, but it is somehow that that's the thing for which you will sacrifice anything if it comes into conflict. Now, God, who is the object of these people's devotion, their wholehearted devotion, is not the only person that demands wholehearted commitment without compromise. So does anyone we seek to love unconditionally. Okay, so if I claim true devotion to my romantic partner, but hedge my bets by keeping options open that aren't going to work out. I'm half-hearted. I'm not all the way in it. My love is conditional until I throw away the exit routes. So if I meant to love my child without condition, my other activities compete with the child's needs, or worse, threaten their safety. I'm half-hearted in my commitment to them. There are other violations of wholeheartedness, corruption, hypocrisy, and sometimes it's a matter of having a mask of holding a value while pursuing something different underneath the surface. That's kind of the nature of corruption or hypocrisy. So that, the police officer who takes bribes, or the teacher or the priest who preys on the young. So total dedication and wholeheartedness are among the strongest themes of the New Testament. So the voice of God who speaks to John in the book of Revelation tells the church of Laodicea, this is a quote from Revelation, "I know your works. I know that you're neither cold nor hot. I wish you were either cold nor hot. So because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I am rich and have no need of anything, and yet do not realize that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked." So in this famous passage, lukewarmness is grounds for rejection by God. Okay, so the wholeheartedness is the condition for entry to the kingdom of heaven. That's why it's like a pearl of great price, which you sell everything. Or why the sons of Zebedee fishing in the Galilee leave their boats and nets to follow Jesus. So the good is somehow incomparably more valuable that you're dedicating yourself to than anything else. Okay, last little bit. So lukewarmness, as I was saying, seems different from corruption. It seems more like lack of commitment, half-heartedness I was discussing earlier. So lukewarmness and compromise suggest a double life built around either a fantasy of self-sufficiency or a fear of decay, and where one's vulnerability and weakness and personal transience is kept private. Okay, this is the very last section. So in its insistence that right living requires wholeheartedness or singleness of mind, Christianity does not break, I don't think, with the classical philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. So Socrates, if you think about the Platonic figure of Socrates, models wholeheartedness. He lives in poverty to the point of neglecting his family for the sake of philosophy, and he dies for it. Plato's Republic has as a central argument that justice is not merely the decoration of a successful life, but is worth the sacrifice of success and every other good besides. Justice is worth everything. And we have this famous quote from the Nicomachean Ethics, which I've always loved, from Aristotle, who's describing our desire for the happiness that is contemplation, which he considers a kind of union with the divine. And he says, "We must not follow those who advise us, being men, to think of human things, being mortal of mortal things, but must, so far as we can, make ourselves immortal, and strain every nerve to live in accordance with the best thing in us. For even if it be small in bulk, much more does it in worth and power surpass everything." So we also have a version of this value of wholeheartedness in the figure of Socrates and in this praise of contemplation. There's something in life which is worth everything. And that, of course, in the classical philosophy is eudaimonia, or happiness. So there's a little bit of a, there's a small point here I'll just make just in case it, maybe it's not small. So if you think about the parallel with the figure of Socrates, it suggests a bit more than just, so I said earlier that these people seem to desire the eternal and transcendent. But I think we can start to see that there's a little more than just the wholehearted pursuit of what's eternal or transcendent. So imagine, so we know that Socrates, for instance, loves what's eternal and transcendent. He says this all the time. But suppose that some kind of indestructible knowledge or wisdom is the thing to which I devote my life and which is the focus of all my longings. Even so, the wise man, when he dies, will lose that wisdom that person has, that you yourself have pursued. That is, your own wisdom, your own understanding, your own knowledge is bound to you. It doesn't outlast your death, even if the object of your knowledge does. So there's a sort of silly analogy you can think about if you think, okay, I want something that will last forever. That's the object of my love. Well, okay, so imagine there's some special kind of rock that we discover lasts forever. Devoting your life to that rock doesn't make any sense. So there's something about we ourselves have to attain eternity with the thing that we love. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why, I think it's very confusing for people who are not, even for people who spend a fair amount of time in Christian literature. There's this weird shifting between subject and object. So, the object is eternal, but I'm seeking eternal life. And, you love Christ, but you become Christ. These things are extremely confusing. But I do think it's important that it's not just the object of love that's eternal and transcendent. It's somehow something happens to the person who does the loving in order that they were able to enjoy that object for the rest of time. So that's some kind of, I don't know how important it is, but it's some kind of nuance that might matter. Okay, so we began by asking what drove Mother Willata Petros or Doña Casilda or many others to renounce wealth, rank, power, romantic love, and filial duty to serve God alone. The perception of the futility or transience of things did not provoke despair or resignation. It was the occasion for falling in love. That object of love has still evaded us in any concrete form. I have said nearly nothing about what that actually is or what it might mean to love it or to live a life devoted to it. But we know something about the basic shape of the object of love that motivates these actions of courage and endurance we've described. It's eternal, it's timeless, it's complete, and in some sense, it's the shape of God himself that, as Ecclesiastes would put it, has been put into our hearts. And this, of course, brings us to a famous sentence from Augustine, that our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. So I'll conclude there and take questions. Thanks for your patience. Oh, questions.
Being recorded, we're going to use the mic for the questions, and I'm happy to see so many hands.
Yes, Mr. Hathaway.
Hi, Ms. Hitz. I have an observation that I hope will develop into a question, or maybe that you can draw it as well. I was struck by the parallels between what you're describing and the kind of detachment in these vocational stories with the hymn to Demeter and her loss of Persephone after the rape by Pluto. And so,
okay, you have to tell me about the text.
Right. So
I don't know the source.
So when Persephone is taken from Earth, Demeter is heartbroken, and she searches for her and fails to find her, and then learns that she's been taken into the underworld. Okay. And in response to that, she tries to negotiate with Zeus to allow Persephone to return. And Zeus at first is unwilling, and Demeter seems to be willing to give up sort of all attachment to Olympian life. And so Spring is never going to return again. And what she does is she joins a family and tries to bestow immortality upon their son. And it almost sounds like what she's trying to do is create a child who is not a victim of transience. And as a result of this, the hymn to Demeter seems to be what we know. It ends with the initiation into the mysteries. Okay. And so the mysteries are the teaching of what happens.
So is it a Homeric hymn? Sorry, I was.
Sorry, it's a Homeric hymn.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
okay,
I'm sorry. Yeah, so the
sorry,
Homeric
yeah,
hymn
yeah,
to
I'm sorry, my
Demeter.
ignorance is great. Right.
And so, but ultimately, what happens is that Persephone is allowed to return for 6 months out of the year,
Right.
because she only eats 6 of the pomegranate seeds. But it seems to me that there's this moment in which Demeter undergoes the same kind of desire for detachment that you're describing, that obviously occurs much later in the Christian world, where she wants to give up all attachment to her own Olympian family as a result of the loss
Right.
of her daughter, which seems this
Right.
parallel. And what she tries to do is to eliminate the possibility that there could be another untimely death by bestowing immortality on this mortal son of another family. But the only reason why she comes back into the fold is because because Persephone, her daughter, returns every year. And so and this is sort of the story that creates the initiation into the mysteries. So there's also a religious element to it as well. And so the question, I guess, is it seems to me that the difference, for all the similarities, is that there's a cyclical return. That means that there's a kind of solution to the problem of transience in the return each year by Persephone, but that Demeter really is also disturbed in the same way that you're describing by the problem of transience, and it's only in this solution of Persephone's eternal return in a way every 6 months that allows her to overcome what you seem to be identifying in the Christian tradition. So I'm not sure if that's a question, but there's something.
No. I think it's a question. I think the question is somehow what kind of solution to the problem is an eternal return. And it's very interesting that you brought it in with a Homeric hymn. This is the second time I've given this talk. Last time I gave it, I got it from Nietzsche, right? So Nietzsche is this thinker who looks into the emptiness of mortal existence and said, oh no, we're going to embrace this. That connected with that is a notion of the eternal return, which I don't understand very well, but I understand this is part of his thinking. So I think I would have to think more about what kind of solution that is. Or whether, so I suppose there's a couple of options, right? One option is that somehow it's a way of keeping possession of the beloved because it always comes back. But I suppose it could also be a kind of like a Sisyphus type thing, right? Like you're just about to, if love really does entail possessing something forever, then you're pretty, it seems like you have them forever, but then it's taken away from you. And then it happens again over and over again. So it depends on whether we're talking about some kind of repeated loss or whether you think of it as being a way of keeping hold of something. I just haven't thought about it enough to know. I'd be grateful for suggestions, if you want to. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wonder if there's a difference in the conception of time. So as
Right.
you're saying, what's next is the question that leads
Yeah.
to a kind of understanding of transience. If you see time as being circular
Yeah.
rather than linear in a way,
Right.
you might be more inclined to see a solution to a problem. But I don't know.
Well, I guess I spent a lot of time in thinking about this with Ecclesiastes, and a generation comes and a generation goes. I don't think it's consoling to see, to think that things will eternally die and then come back and be reborn and die and then be reborn. I think there's something that is also despair-inducing about that vision, but I'm not confident, and I want to think about it more. So feel free to reach out to me later. Oh, now everyone has a question. Okay, I shouldn't have butchered my Nietzsche like that. Darn it. Okay.
Thank you for your talk. It's a really lovely talk
thank
and very rich. So I think there's a line in the symposium that talks about enjoying the good forever, which I think seems to be a kind of, your talk is almost a commentary on that line or something, but
It was unconsciously there. It only came out recently.
But,
It only emerged from the unconscious depths recently.
I want to propose to you a thought, just see what you say about it, which is that kind of counter reading, I guess, of some of what you're thinking, which is that what we see in these religious lives is actually a kind of failure. And so I actually love that Polish film Ada that you're talking about. Saw it in the theater, but it's been a long time. But when you hear her asking that question, as you were talking about it, you might think, boy, this is someone who is unable or incapable of recognizing what's intrinsically valuable right before her eyes. And if the question is, oh, all I've got is beautiful children and a loving home life, but what's next? then you want to think, I think you're not able to register and enjoy and sort of what's right before your eyes. And so that got me thinking, seems like to me there's a way of thinking about this whole tradition that's like that the search for the dissatisfaction with transience, or what we might call impermanence, could actually be seen as a failure to recognize and appreciate the sort of things that do have final value that are there to be seen. And then I guess I'd just kind of connecting up to that skeptical reading, I really like your example of the teapot, or I think it's interesting, I'm not sure what to say about it, the idea that on the one hand, like appreciating the great value of a novel, the proper response to the great value of a novel isn't literally, I wish this novel would never end, or I wish this play is so great, wouldn't it have been better if it never stopped? That seems to be wrong. Like the greatness of the play or the novel depends upon it having a kind of closure. But then I think, like, as you say, but if a certain play was never viewed again, or no one ever read that novel and it went totally out of existence in that way, then I think you can see someone who like really loves a novel, doesn't want it to go on forever, and they don't want to keep reading it forever. Right. But they would be sad if its value and beauty were no longer appreciated or taken up by anyone else for the rest of their lives. So that seems right. But in the case of the teapot, there's nothing about a teapot doesn't have a life. So it's not, the goodness of a teapot doesn't depend upon a kind of anything like the arc of beginning and middle end that applies to novels or plays. And so then I wonder about, in the case of the human or person, loving a person, it seems like a lot depends on, do you think a person is the kind of thing that is the bearer of a life? And a life is kind of like a play. It has a closure such that to wish it to keep going on forever would be a kind of confusion, or not. And I'm not sure what the right answer to that is, but it does seem like maybe something depends upon that. And if you think it's more like the play, then you might think what these people in your thing are the people with these vocations are, they sort of failed to recognize that and to realize that the thing that you love when you love someone is the kind of thing that has to come to an end, like a play, or is the bearer of something, a life that has to come to an end. So I throw that set of thoughts out there. It's just a kind of way of expanding on some of the things you're saying, but also seeing how someone could see these stories and realize these people are just, I feel their pain, but there's a truth about what the way things are that is the truth of our temporality, our mortality. And I'll just close by because since you're talking about Socrates, I mean, I think it's in the Apology where he says something like, if at my age, I were to be sad about dying, I would be like a glutton who's had this long meal and won't leave the table. And the satisfaction of a meal seems to have that same kind of arc. I'm hungry, I'm enjoying it, and it's done. Yeah. And to grieve the transience of the meal can be seen as a kind of gluttony.
But you realize the danger of asking a question that long is that you're going to aspiring too long an answer. So I'm going to try to be a little bit restrained in trying to answer it. So I think part of my thinking about this, which didn't make its way into the talk, and there was just a brief remark about how. So I think it's common. It's a familiar critique of this type of thinking. Eh? I mean, you said it very eloquently, that somehow the point of life is appreciating things as mortal. I'm very skeptical about this. So on the one hand, I think and it might be true about Ida. I have to think about that. I mean, and part of me wants to keep talking about the film, but probably not everyone has seen it. But there's something about the death of her aunt, and the fact that her aunt definitely treasures many happy experiences, or intense experiences, and commits suicide. There's something about that I think must be in the back of his mind. But I think that might be, so I don't want to get bogged down in a particular case where she might be a person who doesn't see what's good about it. That's not the way Doña Casilda is described. So it's not that she somehow, you get the sense from the way that Teresa describes her that she fully appreciates and loves this person and this moment. And she knows that there's more to life than that. And one way of trying to see that, and I'm not speaking with perfect confidence, it's something I struggle to understand myself. One way to see that is to think, just as, there's this feature about grief that I talked about with Mother Maria, where there's, someone dies young, it's terrible. But there's this weird vertigo when you think, this was always a mortal thing, right? So, for the particular human subject, the parent, it's a terrible thing. It's one of the worst things that could happen to you. But of course, every child will die. And there's a kind of illusion that's created by the fact that these deaths are spaced out in such a way that one doesn't have to confront them all at the same time. And the same is true, I think, for any kind of destruction. That is, one of the things I found helpful was thinking about, apocalyptic scenarios. So say that not just this novel or this play or this experience or this romance comes to an end, but absolutely everything like it comes to an end. And that's what I was getting at in the allusion to, what happens if not just this novel, but all novels disappear? What happens if not just this musical piece, not just this composer, but all music is somehow eradicated from the earth? Doesn't it feel like something is wrong? And that's the idea that when I love these things, I want them to last forever. So that entailment is the basic idea. Now, how important is that love to make a life fulfilling and meaningful? So is it enough to say, this particular desire, it can't be satisfied because everything I love passes away? So part of the question, I think, in this kind of, maybe I'm not speaking very clearly, but part of it is about what the status of that desire is. My thought is something like, that's your desire for happiness. The thing to possess something that doesn't end, in a way that doesn't end. And if you can't have it, your life has not been completed. You may grasp at some things as they go, and you may, satisfy yourself with a sort of play of one thing after another, but that desire in your heart is not satisfied. Anyway, I'll say that and then take more questions. Sorry, it takes a lot. Yes.
Hello, thank you. That was quite enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, I think it's a similar question, but slightly different. I wanted to ask about what you see as maybe the tension between the universal and the particular, the finite and the infinite, particularly in the particular and facilitating a certain type of engagement with eternal things and appreciation of those eternal things in a way that detachment cannot. And so your examples, especially since most of them revolved around monastic life, reminded me of Thomas Merton, the monastic at the Abbey of Kissimmee in Kentucky, right? Had a very conventional conversion narrative, like Augustine, withdrew from his life of depravity, right, to enter this monastery. And then in his early 50s found that this devotion that he had felt towards God, right, this focus on God alone, had diminished the happiness he was able to get out of that pursuit, right? Like it was meaningless because it was detached from the particular instantiations of the eternal. And I mean, he had a sordid love affair and there was a lot going on in his life, but he in Kentucky at one point, he said that it suddenly struck him that everyone in the world was actually a reflection of the goodness. He said he saw them walking around and shining like the sun. That was the quote. And thereafter, he devoted his life to economic issues, opposing the Vietnam War, right? He died for that in Thailand. But the point he was getting at, right, is that there's something about detachment for the devotion of the good in itself that means something, but it's meaningless without the finite expressions of that thing, right?
Right.
I didn't know if you could speak to that.
No, I think it's connected to the previous question, actually, and it's something I didn't really talk about. So what happens if you see these stories, not just at the beginning, but if you patch them together with other stories so that you get a sense of what a whole life devoted to religion is. The moment of vocation is the moment of turning away, it's the moment of kind of conversion. And you aim towards this transcendent and you give everything up, right? And then, because what you're going for is God, and God is the creator of the world and the source of all the good in the world, once you have succeeded in properly attaining your focus, once you've achieved a kind of wholeheartedness, then your experience is transformed. And you see the goodness of things that you previously had to sacrifice. So I think one of the things that's a bit misleading about the talk, which I think I'm starting to realize, is that there's a way in which that vocation moment involves the perception of a profound truth. But there's another way, and that's an incomplete truth. It's an incomplete truth because the thing that you're going after is God, and God, in fact, is present in some sense, or is illuminated by all these things. And in a way, I think it's, so I think that's, there has to be a transformation of a person's experience that happens through the pursuit of this transcendent eternal good for that kind of, for that kind of recognition of the goodness, beauty, wonderfulness of everyday experience. And there's something very condensed about it in Mother Maria Skotsova, because I didn't read these passages. They're beautiful, and they're unfortunately not, the whole thing isn't translated. It's just in the preface to her autobiography, or to her biography. But you know, Mother Maria dedicated her life to helping the poor and the homeless in Paris, and eventually sheltering Jewish people who were fleeing the Holocaust. So she dedicated her, and her vocation was service to other human beings. And if you think about it, it's like the St. Francis of Assisi, right? So, you know, he renounces his clothing and his wealth and so on, and he encounters the leper. So the complete picture has to involve these kinds of things, and I think focusing on this moment can give a distorted picture. So thank you.
I think my question is similar to Taylor's. It did sort of, did get the impression that this wholeheartedness, which this wholehearted way of expressing love, which does sound like a good thing. But from all of your examples, it did sound like the best way to do that was to join a convent or become a monk or something. And then I would have the same, I was thinking, well, think about all those people you're leaving behind. Think of the pain that you're causing your parents, your siblings, and are there different ways? Can there be different ways of expressing wholeheartedness, expressing this kind of transcendent love? Maybe your response to her sort of answered that. It sounded like you were saying, well, yes, you don't have to withdraw from the world. And that was my question. Why? It almost sounded like the only way to express this sort of higher form of love was to withdraw from the world rather than connect with people and deal with all the pain that comes with that.
Right. Thank you. So the intention of the talk was to start with a couple of examples that I think of behavior that I think seems to us weird, namely the renunciation of everything to go do this. So, and then to look at what they said about what they were doing. So, she sees the transience of things, or this day will come to an end like all the rest. So it wasn't meant to be a comment. It may have shifted too quickly to somehow, these are the only lives one should live. I do think that, so I don't mean to rule out that there might be other ways of living wholeheartedly, but I think if we take seriously these people, if you take them seriously and ask yourself what kind of problem are they facing, what is it that they see about the world that could make them do something so radical? And maybe in thinking about it, you end up like our friend here, sorry, I don't know your name, saying, well, you know what, like this desire I have for something that wholeheartedly that will never die, it can't be satisfied. So I'm going to live in whatever the chaos of everything else is. But if you take it seriously and try to imagine what it's like to be these people, then I think you have to think that there is something that each of us needs to escape in ordinary life. It doesn't necessarily have to be by escaping it, you might not have to give up your relationships. Maybe your relationships will just be transformed. It doesn't mean you have to give up the pursuit of business or making money or a career. Maybe you just have to transform your attitude to it. But I think it's fundamental to Christianity that there's something different about living for the transcendent, eternal God and it requires an actual conversion. So some major change has to happen. And what these stories do, and this is part of what I think the function of religious life is meant to be within Christianity, is it makes it extremely clear, right, that there's more to life than all these other things. If you allow yourself to take in the question, take them seriously and think about what they might be pursuing. So it's just a kind of a clarifying thing, right? So that doesn't mean that there isn't any other way of living in a way that's in some way detached or has a right view of one's relationships or one's career, but it does mean that each of us has some kind of difficulty from the point of view of Christianity that needs to be overcome, even if it doesn't look as dramatic or as wild, and even if it involves keeping relationships with your loved ones and making money and having some power and status in the world. I mean, like me, So if it weren't, I'd be in trouble, I think. So, yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you very much for your talk, and I really enjoyed the Q&A session. So I'm going to continue in a pretty unoriginal way by continuing in the same vein as some of the previous
I know,
questions.
please, it helps me, yeah.
Okay, so I'm trying to follow the advice that you just gave, trying to see the world from the point of view of some of the folks that you've talked about.
Yeah.
And part of what they want is wholeheartedness, which I think is important. And then they want to escape something transient. But surely, given their beliefs, they think other persons are not transient. Like, do they really think the kids that they might have would be transient entities? Wouldn't they think that persons are eternal? Like, they can't think they're the only immortal thing, them and God. So, like, I'm trying to get in their heads and figure out why a life devoted, now we're going to see why money and youth and power and prestige are going to be precarious. Not just transient, but precarious. Even if they lasted forever, your possession of them would be precarious at any time. So there's a kind of precarity there. When it comes to other persons, so this leads me to think a little bit further, like, what is it that motivates them? And I think there's a helpful term from a book on games, of all things, by T. Nguyen, and it's value clarity. And I think wholeheartedness really requires value clarity, and that a lot of what makes up for the half-hearted rest of us in humanity is just a failure of value clarity. And I think there's a really interesting story you could tell about what gives rise to value confusions. I think, for instance, Max Scheler is a philosopher who says quite a bit about the phenomenology of value consciousness and how it can be clear or muddy. But it seems to me that the repudiation of everything else and a sole focus on God, not God's world, not God's creations and purposes, a sole focus on like the first half of the Great Commandment gives them an initial value clarity that is utterly overwhelming. And that might be part of, because, I mean, persons might be eternal. So it's not just fleeing what's transient. It's also this combination of complete and total value clarity, which, like the example of, was it Thomas Merton? The example of Merton, maybe as time goes on, they will, in your words, have a transfigured or transformed view of the whole world and see it in a totally new way, and it re-achieved the value clarity that was missing in their initial foray into the world. But I wonder if that notion of value clarity does any work here. I mean, it seems to bear an important connection with wholeheartedness. It also seems to maybe remove what looks like a cognitive dissonance when I try to view these folks from their own point of view.
Right. So I think that's very helpful to think about what the difference might be in the types of renunciations, that is, the renunciations of family relations or people, and renunciations of wealth, power, status, etc. And that, in a way, might be behind also some of what the previous question was asking about. I don't know how value clarity, I mean, I don't know enough about that literature to know what it's adding to wholeheartedness or what it's adding to maybe the kind of thing I was just saying, where suddenly you, like, because other people do this kind of thing, right? So it's not that somehow everyone should do this, but because other people do this, because Anthony the Abbot once lived in the desert and ate bugs for 60 years, that's a kind of testament to that there's something eternal and transcendent that's present even in a life like that. Yeah. So there's a kind of defiance in it or something like that. Because the fact is, even within the worldview of Christianity, it's quite difficult to believe this, right? So it's difficult to believe in an invisible, transcendent, eternal being. So, if you're suddenly taken with the truth of this fact, if you confront the truth of this fact, then you might feel called to demonstrate that by living a particularly radical kind of life. I do think that the question about other people, there's a section in the book about it, but it's not tightly connected to this question about transience, so I would have to do some thinking to figure out how to work it out. But our relationships to other people are not always, I stand before the goodness of this being. I mean, that's just not how we always relate to other people. I mean, and I love this being just because they are an image of God. That's actually not very common in terms of our relationships to others. And even though families or intimate relationships or even parents and children can be incredibly fruitful sources of meaning, and they are the way most of us, even those of us who are Christians, find our way to something else, like you work, right? You stay in a relationship and you recognize that you're not perceiving this person as good, so you're continually reaching for it, even though they're driving you nuts, leaving their socks on the floor and stuff like that. So, but you keep reaching for this vision that they are images of God, and it's often in poverty and in darkness, right, where you're most in touch with this transcendent fact. But the point is that these relationships are not always like that, and they're often obstacles to us living wholeheartedly. That doesn't mean that one should be like cruel or abandon them coldly, but one does need to recognize that just because, that not every friendship and not every loving relationship and not every familiar relationship has the same kind of value to it, to put it perfectly ruthlessly. Like, many of them can be a source of incredible value, the same kind of value that Mother Maria has serving the poor of Paris, and some of them don't. And some of them need start one way and can change into the other. But it's a much more complicated question, and I went through it too quickly to suggest that somehow other people are parallel to wealth. So thank you very much for the question. Appreciate it.
I'm going to allow myself to ask a question. So this harkens back a little bit to Micah's question, and I guess it wonders how you would respond to not a Nietzschean but a kind of Emersonian objection that says that at the end of the day, this is a failure, a way of being alienated from who we are as human beings. And that, like the example of Socrates and gluttony, that there's a kind of failure in demanding that things would go on forever. And that it's a failure to value things as they actually are and to see things as they actually are. And thus, the move to the religious life is like a flight from reality and a flight from what it is to be a human. And I want to make a connection in a second, but just to tease this, like, think about if we had a parent who wanted their child to stay a child forever, we would see that as a kind of disordered love, right? And I think the Emersonian push is to say this is kind of like that in relationship to the world. It's a refusal of who you actually are. And he doesn't take this into like the Nietzschean direction, but in a very different direction. And I think there's a response to this, but I just want to hear what your thoughts
Well,
on
if you
it
think
are.
there's a response, David, come on. Let me say this, and then I want you to tell me what your response is. One of the things that this particular type of question reminds me of, it's something in the philosophy literature on meaning of life, the secular philosophy literature, contemporary 20th century Anglophone type stuff, where it's like, oh, we would never want to live forever. Like, there would be, everything would lose its poignancy and its beauty, and its there's something that we appreciate about things as mortal and fragile. And there's a poignancy in their loss that you would miss if you had them forever. And I think that that's based on a kind of misunderstanding, because it's not, but I think it's something that I really should articulate, so it's a genuine failing in my account. It's not as if somehow you want, there's something in your love that wants eternity. It doesn't have to be eternally the same thing just as it is. It has to be something else. I mean, what's this experience of poignancy anyway? Poignancy is a sign that we really deeply desire something that we're not getting from this situation. So you don't have poignancy without a sense of disappointment that this thing is ending. And I don't know exactly how to articulate that in real life, in real relationships, in relationship to real beings, what that desire for eternity is, what that sense is that this is not enough. But I don't think it's a matter of like, I want this person to become a wax doll, which I cling to forever in exactly the same way. I don't think it's like that. But that means that I haven't quite articulated it. So I'm grateful for your help in telling me how you think the response should be.
I mean, I'm not sure, but I mean, I think it connects to Walter's question, that we can distinguish between an idea of completeness, like the completeness of a human life, and thus regard it especially tragic when a child dies, because there's a recognition that they were just beginning their life. This is not, and that's one set of concerns. But I think you're right, and I agree at least, that death as such is unsettling and something that we don't want in a very deep way. That is the right way for this parent is to relate to the child is indeed, I don't want this person to remain a child forever, but I do want this person to go on forever and to be in relationship with this person forever. And I think that that's a way of also responding to some extent to the misanthropy that some of the anecdotes can maybe unintentionally conjure up. And that is the recognition that persons are the most dangerous things to love. And that in so many of these cases, and I think Taylor's example of Merton, that and you were gesturing to this with your idea of a conversion, that to love a person rightly requires a kind of transformation, because there's so many dangerous ways, idolatrous ways, corrupting, destructive ways that we can end up loving a person. And so that many of these people are fleeing to the ultimate good so that then they can begin eventually to relate rightly to all of these penultimate goods. And just one last thought on that. A friend of mine who is a Dominican friar, he said, the reason I became a friar is because it was the only way that I could figure out actually to love God, all right? And that doesn't then suggest that that is the only way anyone else can figure out how to do this, but for him, it certainly was.
I have another example like that, and then there were probably other questions still. No, there was a story like that that's even more dramatic of a woman I knew. So I relate in both the books. I lived in a religious community for a time in Eastern Ontario. There was a woman who belonged to the Madonna House community that I lived in, who, if you asked her, as you could in this community, like, well, how did you end up here? And she said, well, I wanted to learn how to love. And someone said, if you want to learn how to love, go talk to this person, the woman in front of the community. So she joined the community to learn how to love. So it wasn't for her, it wasn't a matter of like, how do I renounce love for the sake even of the love of God, but just like, I can't love other people unless I love God in a certain way, unless I live in a certain kind of order. So thank you for the sharp and challenging questions. I appreciate it very much.
We have time for one or two more questions if anyone has a lingering one.
You look like you have a question in the green. No? No, you don't have a question. Okay, sorry. I didn't mean to call you out.
I don't know if it's a question as much as just kind of processing what other people are saying. One thing that I'll be thinking about from your talk is the interplay between transience and purpose. And to me, some of the distinction there is kind of getting to the bottom of means versus ends. Like the transient things are things that are a means, whereas the purpose ties into things that are ends in themselves. I think you said something to that effect that I'm going to be kind of thinking about. Also, early on, you mentioned just what is it about poverty? And I'm a sci-fi nerd. It made me think of a really poignant passage in C.S. Lewis's Paralandra, where there's this green berry that he eats that's just like transcendently delicious, and his impulse is to have another because it was such a perfect pleasure. And then he stops himself and realizes it would be a sacrilege to have another because he was perfectly satisfied by the one he had. And he ponders to himself the connection between that and money, and that what money is the ability to have again any pleasure that we want. And so when you talk about these people who have chosen to renounce possessions and money and the idea of wholeheartedness, I think that renouncing possessions and money is in a way kind of burning that bridge to being able to have again these more transient pleasures in a sign of absolute commitment to pursuing that ultimate pleasure.
So that is helpful because I think it points to, the question really is about what detachment is, right? And in a way, especially in the monastic traditions, detachment is a means to appreciation, actually. It's not a means to, it's not a rejection. It's, the way that we customarily live is not in this way treasuring, the temporality of each thing. That's in fact how religious live. But the way a lot of us live is like frenetically trying to chase the high, right? And to get back to a feeling that you once had before. Whereas detaching from it, a detachment says, okay, this is what it is. Like, a lot of communities practice liturgical eating. So you eat kind of simple food, and then like the feast days, you just like, that's when all the chocolate and whatever else goes on. And nothing tastes like, that, like, you really appreciate whatever it is that you haven't eaten for the 40 days of Lent or whatever. So I think there's something in that, and I'm going to keep working on how to reconcile it with all the other pieces. Thanks for your help so much.
All right, join me in thanking Professor Hitz. Thanks to all of you for coming out, and stay tuned for further events from the Institute this spring. Bye-bye.